So welcome, I'm Revesz, and I'm just here for like a very brief welcome. We have, this is a very exciting day for the law school because we're launching this center on constitutional transitions with this conference on constitutional transitions in the Middle East. And you know this is a real and serious operation because we now have a website. And so what could be more tangible than a website? I'm really grateful to my colleague Sujit Choudhry for setting this up. I think it's going to be a fabulous new venture for the law school. I'm very excited about the clinical program that will get students working with NGOs and with governments around these issues. I'm very grateful to all the participants in this terrific conference that Sujit put together. And I think it's a very auspicious day for working through these sorts of issues in academic institutions. Academic institutions in the US and elsewhere haven't always been great at being user-friendly to the people who actually need this kind of help. And it's my sort of fervent hope that we will actually be very good at that. And my conversations over the last year with Sujit around this gives me great confidence that that will in fact be the case. His coming to NYU Law School from near Toronto was a great moment for our law school. He's joined our faculty full-time for this academic year, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what this institution will build. I know that these days I'm just sort of the filler that stands between people sort of walking in and the beginning of the academic excitement, so I'll be very brief. I'll go. Also, when I leave, I'll have to be reduced again to wearing this button that says, "Hi, I'm Ricky," which is what law school administrators do for admitted student day. I took it off, to symbolize the intellectual seriousness of this occasion, but I'll be back to wearing this button. So I'll leave you in the great hands of my colleague, Sujit, who will introduce the panel and the panelists, and I very much look forward to what we build as a result of these efforts starting very soon. So thank you so much for being here.
So thanks for coming. My name is Sujit Choudhry, and it's really wonderful that you're here at our first event. The event has a dual purpose to it. The first is to provide an occasion to reflect together on the profound constitutional transformations that are happening in the Middle East and North Africa, led by really a distinguished set of colleagues, and we'll talk about this in a moment. But the second is to talk a bit about, is to mark the launch, I should say, of the Center for Constitutional Transitions. And so let me talk a little bit about what that is. And so there's a website here, as Ricky says, and so I would invite you to go to our website and have a look at what we have planned for the center. But what I might do is just take a couple of minutes before turning it over to the panel to tell you what we have in mind and how this launch event is a fitting beginning to our activities. So constitutional transitions are a pervasive part of modern political life. Since the late 1970s, there have been over 180 new constitutions drafted and adopted. There have been also 200 major constitutional amendments. And there's a lot of research that's been generated by these transitions on substantive questions of how to draft these constitutions, on procedural issues. And these processes are now also very globalized. They're globalized in terms of the ideas they draw upon. They're also globalized because there's lots of international involvement and assistance in support for many of these processes. And so what motivates the creation of the center is that we think at NYU that there's an important niche in the world of constitution building for a center that focuses on research and education. And why is that? One reason is that there are often issues that arise in the field of constitution building where there's no research or the research is inadequate. So I'll give you two examples, one from the Middle East and one not. So ethnically divided cities has been a huge issue in Iraq, Mitrovica in Kosovo. This is something which there's no research done. Neither scholars of constitutional design nor scholars of local government actually have written a lot about this. Disputes over natural resources, Bolivia, Indonesia, Sudan, and in fact Iraq as well, are at the center of many constitutional transitions. And again, questions of natural resource ownership, management, revenue collection, revenue distribution have attracted almost no attention from constitutional scholars. And so our view at NYU is that constitutional advice is only good if it's rooted in research. If it's not rooted in knowledge, then advice is often misguided or can be not helpful. And as well, international advisors who often attach themselves to these processes, and there's many of them, don't have the in-house research capacity to do this type of work. And they often deploy advisors to the field who are bombarded with requests on topics where there is research, but there's no infrastructure to support them in the field when they're asked to give this advice. And so what we want to do is build a center at NYU that supports existing efforts at constitution building through research and education. And so what are we planning on doing here? So the first, on the research side, what we're planning on doing is to structure and lead thematic research projects that essentially address questions that are practically important in the field to transitions underway, but would also actually attract a significant scholarly interest because there's an inadequacy or gap in the existing research. And for each of these projects, what we're doing is working with regional partners, preferably think tanks, research-based NGOs or universities, and together with our regional partners to kind of populate an international research network of scholars from around the world to address these issues. And so to be more specific, our first project is going to be on security sector oversight in post-authoritarian contexts, how to protect democratic consolidation from partisan abuse. And so basically the problem is that civilian oversight of the security sector is an essential component of democratic rule. It's a central part of transitions to democracy, but there's a real challenge of the governing party in the first round, or in the first post-authoritarian government, of capturing the security sector that once oppressed it, and then turning it to its own ends. And this is not a hypothetical problem, it's actually a very real problem, not just in the Middle East and North Africa, but elsewhere. And so what we're doing now is creating a network of scholars from Latin America, from Western Europe, from Asia, from the Middle East and North Africa, from North America, to study in a kind of a focused way exactly how legal and institutional design might address these types of problems. And our partners for this project are the Center for the Implementation of Public Policies and Promoting Equity and Growth in Argentina, the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights in Cairo, and the Turkish Economic and Social Studies Foundation in Istanbul. On the educational side, as Dean Revesz mentioned, we're also going to be starting a clinic. And so the idea here is that the clinic will be a research back office for advisors working in the field to produce just-in-time research. And so our first, and the clinic will bring together international students and American students, 20 students every year who will do this type of work in a structured way. And our first client here is the Middle East and North Africa office of International IDEA, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, which advises on transitions from Morocco to Jordan. And they're producing technical inputs to all these processes, and we will be providing the research support to enable them to do that. And we're working with Zaid Al-Ali, who is the director of the Constitution Building team there as well. So that's what we're up to. So the final note, we're quite delighted that at NYU next year we have a number of visitors who will be affiliated with the center. Radhika Kumraswamy, who's Special Representative of the UN, Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict, and a veteran of Sri Lankan constitutional politics. Christina Murray, Professor of Human Rights Law at the University of Cape Town, who's a veteran of the Kenyan and South African processes, and Gianluca Parolin from American University of Cairo, who's written quite extensively on the Gulf monarchies and constitutional reform in the Gulf, and as well is very closely monitoring the Egyptian transition. So finally, this conference. So the Middle East and North Africa is witnessing the greatest degree of political transformation and regime change in a generation. Constitutional transitions of various forms are at the center of many of these processes in countries as diverse as Egypt, Libya, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, and Turkey. We are honored that many of the leading experts on Middle East constitutionalism in North America are here today at NYU to offer their reflections on developments in the region. Aslı Bâli from UCLA, Mohammed Varol from Toronto, Turkuler Isiksel from Columbia, Clark Lombardi from University of Washington, Chibli Malat from Utah, and Ozan Varol, soon to be from Lewis and Clark. And so we're delighted they're here. And as well, two of my very distinguished colleagues, Sam Issacharoff and Kevin Davis, have agreed to chair panels. And I've been very grateful to them for doing this and also for all their advice as we get this off the ground. So on that note, I would like to turn it over to Professor Issacharoff. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sujit. Well, it's a pleasure to open the conference on to the first substantive panel and the first substantive panel of Sujit's impressive new center. It is not my want to back off from the real issues that that confront us, and I think that it's a wonderful opportunity to reflect on the transitions in the Middle East and North Africa of the past few years from the vantage point of Turkey. Turkey, to my mind, is neither of the Middle East nor North Africa. It is one of the most interesting, difficult, complicated, fascinating countries in the world in terms of the issues which we have to discuss. And it poses in stark fashion a fundamental problem that confronts all the transitions from authoritarian regimes to what we will euphemistically call post-authoritarian regimes, since that's the one thing that we can agree on, is that if it's no longer authoritarian, and it once was, it should therefore be called post-authoritarian. But what does it mean to be post-authoritarian? We have a wonderful term that we like to use. We call it constitutional democracy. That is what we want. Well, constitutional democracy is an oxymoron. Constitutions are limitations on the sovereign will of the people. Constitutions enable democracies to function. They constrain and shape democratic politics, but they also limit it against the temporary will of the people. Democracy ultimately is majorities being able to use the instrumentalities of state power to achieve the objectives that unified them electorally. There is inherent tension between these two, and the tension is most acute in these post-authoritarian regimes when you have certain critical features that have to be confronted. One is illiberal constitutionalism. That means constitutionalism which is designed to take certain issues off the table, to limit what the people can do, to prevent certain kind of politics from emerging, for good or for ill. So that Turkey has a long-standing, distinct constitutional commitment to the territorial integrity of Turkey as a nation. That has severe consequences for the types of democratic politics that can emerge in Turkey. It has had those for some time. It has confronted directly the multi-ethnic quality of the Turkish Republic, and it forces confrontations with the most difficult and isolated region of the country, the Kurdish population of the southeast of the country. You also have illiberal democracy. That is, when majorities organize and are able to sustain a political commitment around objectives that preserve their hegemony as against their historic enemies, that impose conditions on minorities in the population, and that threaten the security and the prospects for tolerant inclusion in the society of many minorities. This is a constant problem. Sometimes it takes the form of religious exclusion or religious mandates. Sometimes it takes the form of ethnic supremacy. Sometimes it takes the form of lustration of the former heads of the country. Sometimes it takes the form that seems benign but is intended to exclude, as with linguistic hegemony within any given multi-ethnic country. Then you get other features. You get majorities that try to lock themselves in power perpetually. You get nationalism that often takes the form of state-sponsored violence against historic minorities, historic enemies. All of these emerge within the context of post-authoritarianism. One need only look at post-Tito Yugoslavia and say that the post-authoritarian regime is not necessarily a panacea. One can look at many post-authoritarian governments where the part of the world that my family is originally from Uzbekistan, and say that the fall of the Soviet Union did not augur in a period of milk and honey or whatever other metaphor we want to use. So the question is not the abstraction of we're all in favor of good things, constitutions, yes, no, sure, why not, democracy, yes, no, certainly yes, but the real hard issues. How do you govern these transitions? How do you go from a society that has been brutalized to one that does not turn into a war of all against all, or at least of some organized factions against other organized factions? And the answer, unfortunately, is that you need institutions to do this. And these institutions tend to have been beaten down in authoritarian regimes. Civil society is weak, democratic traditions are poor, there is no education in the domain of tolerant electoral politics, and out of this, you have to build a constitutional democracy. Turkey is the great example, because Turkey, you can write the critique. Hundreds of opposition leaders in jail to this day. Tremendous pressure upon the opposition media. Much of the former power structure in Turkey is today under indictment for conspiracy to overthrow the regime. Maybe yes, maybe no. As a general matter, it's not a good day when most of the political opposition is under indictment for any democratic country in the world. So how do we deal with all these things? And today we're going to have three papers that have three distinct takes on this, and this is the order in which we're going to present them. Aslı has a fascinating paper that focuses on the emergence of a new constitutional court and a new constitutional judiciary in Turkey. The role of constitutional courts has been a recent focus of scholarship. There is controversy about the role of these constitutional courts. Ron Herschel says that they are the domain of the former secular elite, and that their main role in these weak democracies is to take from the majority population that which they want to do. I have countered that no, in fact, if one looks at the experience of South Africa, at Mexico, at South Korea, at Eastern Europe, what one finds is not a commitment to secularism, but a commitment to democratic transitions and the forestalling of the concentration of power. This is controversial. Turkey is a great example for this because the Constitutional Court was the ally of the military for many years in suppressing what some thought was extremism in popular democratic politics, what others thought was the expression of the popular democratic will. That's Aslı's paper. Then we're going to have Ozan's paper, which provocatively says the institution that should follow and secure the transition is the military. And the military is, in fact, the only institution that can stand above. I was born and raised in Argentina. The idea that the military is the friend of democracy comes as news to me, I have to confess. So I am eager to hear how these militaries are the allies of democracy. On the other hand, you look around the world at democratic transitions, and sometimes the allies are the least expected. Look at Spain. The Carlist monarchy, all of a sudden, was the transition to the modern era. Now, there's one that you would have bet a lot of money against for about 300 years, that the Carlists were not going to be the force of progress. And then finally, we have Turkuler's paper, which says, in some sense, most ambitiously, and perhaps with most difficulty, that the Constitution itself is the institutional commitment to democracy, and that the Constitution, in its rigidity, and in fact, she doesn't hold back, she says in its authoritarian tendencies, is what makes democracy possible. These are great topics because Turkey is not Egypt. Turkey is not Syria. Turkey is a thriving, successful country, half in, half out of Europe, as it has always been, half in, half out of Asia, as it has always been, and a complicated society that may very well be the best hope one has in the region. So with that, let me turn it over to the panelists. Aslı.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm delighted to participate in this opening conference of this very exciting new center. And it's also a great pleasure for me to be on this particular panel because I rarely have the privilege of being on a panel with two other scholars who study Turkey and Turkish constitutionalism. And for me, it's really a great honor to have the opportunity to meet them and talk with them about their ideas. And I was fascinated by their papers. So my paper, by contrast, is a short thought paper, which was our remit, in fact, for this particular conference. But it is one that I have thought quite a bit about, and it's around the judiciary. So I start by saying, as several of us do, in fact, that Turkey has been proposed as a model, and this was also picked up in Professor Issacharoff's comments, and in particular in the Egyptian case, it's been described as a potential model for transition, and it has certain kinds of desirable features, inclusion of political Islamist parties that are nonetheless playing by the rules of the game, that are remaining within the constraints of a particular constitutional order, and so on. I think largely, though, that when people think about the critique of that claim, and we're going to hear some about this from Ozan, you hear about their concerns about military guardianship. And indeed, I think they're quite right to point to that question because I think some who invoke Turkey as a model indeed are in some ways excited about military guardianship as a possibility. So although they may speak to the kinds of attractive features that one sees about Turkish society generally or Turkish institutions generally, in fact, part of the agenda is to say a military that serves the kind of guardianship role that the Turkish military has served in the Turkish model may be a desirable feature in a country that's transitioning and faces the possibility of real Islamist politics without perhaps a well-organized opposition. So in fact, they're invoking the Turkish model precisely because of the role the military plays, and that's an appropriate locus of criticism. What I think is less well understood, though, is the ways in which courts operate in similar contexts. And I think Turkey is an extremely interesting example to look at to think about what happens when the military's guardianship role gets eclipsed. So what happens in a kind of more interim period in transition, which is what I argue in this paper has happened in the Turkish context, when courts step in to play that guardianship role in a way that the military no longer can for a set of reasons related to political constraints. So this is somewhat consonant with the argument that, again, Professor Issacharoff mentioned, Ron Herschel's argument around juristocracy, the idea that courts can be used to entrench privileges of a particular elite. But I think it's actually against Professor Herschel's more recent work, Constitutional Theocracy, in which he also suggests that courts are invested with a certain power of liberal interpretation that may constrain political Islam and so forth. So I think I would probably be somewhere in the middle and likely or closer to your position, except that I think that there are some real constraints on when and how courts can actually operate in ways that are democracy enhancing for the reasons that you were suggesting in your opening comments. So let me just turn then to the Turkish example that I speak to. And really I'm looking at not so much the emergence of the Turkish Constitutional Court as a process of reform that that court has undergone very recently in September 2010. I had actually hoped to be able to speak about a new constitutional draft today at the time that we were discussing that there was a possibility that a constitution that's currently in the process of being drafted in Turkey might have already been circulated in draft form in time for me to have taken a look at it before this meeting, but that isn't the case. And so the most recent exercise we've had in constitutional transition in Turkey was a very thoroughgoing set of amendments to the Constitution that were passed by referendum in September 2010, which involved 26 separate amendments in 4 crucial areas of constitutional reform, and I'm going to turn to that. I do want to say 2 things to foreground my commentary here. One is, returning to the Egyptian comparison, I once wrote a paper probably some 7 years ago that Professor Malat was present for my presentation of, which compared the Turkish Constitutional Court with the Supreme Constitutional Court of Egypt. And at that time I said the Supreme Constitutional Court of Egypt has a far better record in every possible respect with respect to a liberalizing effect on a democratizing society, to the extent that one could have described either country at that time in those terms. That has changed dramatically in the remaining time because the Mubarak regime took steps to alter the composition of the Egyptian Supreme Constitutional Court. We have yet to see what kind of a role it may play. But that very moment, what happened in Egypt, I'm going to argue, is the exact opposite. In other words, there's a divergence. And from the time that I had once compared these two institutions and found the Egyptian institution to be preferable, I now would say that following a set of reforms that Turkey undertook, the Turkish Constitutional Court now has the prospect of actually serving a much more salutary function. Now, what's interesting about this is I say this about a set of reforms that were overwhelmingly received in the United States, but also in general by secular, sort of liberal-minded constitutionalists as court packing. So these amendments were decried and considered to be quite damaging to Turkish constitutionalism at the time that they passed. And so I'm making an argument that is sort of against that conventional wisdom, suggesting that actually what these reforms introduced was something extremely positive in the Turkish system that may enable the Turkish Constitutional Court now to play a role that it has not played previously in the constitutional order from the time that it was in fact introduced in the 1960s. So this argument proceeds around sort of three different claims. The first is that we need to think very carefully about what we mean when we say judicial independence, and in particular that we need to understand clearly the kinds of values that we're committing ourselves to. So typically in the United States and in general in sort of Western constitutional thought, we think of judicial independence in terms of separation of powers, checks and balances, the ways in which the political branches can be held to account with respect to sets of principles that are entrenched in the Constitution when they may go awry, when they may do some of the illiberal things that Professor Issacharoff was speaking to, presuming that, of course, we have a Constitution that protects liberal values, liberal rights. So what did I say there? Separation of powers and checks and balances. Now, I think that this is an assumption that we have and that goes often is stated implicitly instead of explicitly. We say it simply by the shorthand separation of powers. And that is, in fact, the case in the Turkish context. People worried a great deal about separation of powers and the consequences for separation of powers of these constitutional reforms. But I posit that what they mean when they say separation of powers has nothing to do with checks and balances and little to do with the meaning of judicial independence as we would understand it here as a set of values we would be committed to. Rather, the separation that persons in Turkey and outside of Turkey were concerned with is the separation of powers between what I call, and I believe maybe I will be challenged on, the elected and unelected branches of government. So I take very much the model that Ozan suggests and we'll speak to in a moment, that Turkey, in fact, has long been characterized by a political system with 4 branches of government, which would be the 3 that we're familiar with, plus the military, which acts as its own branch of government. And of course, again, as I say, people focus on the role of the military for their critiques when they're worried about this model, and in particular because, of course, militaries don't enjoy, at least when organized in the way that they are in Turkey, democratic accountability, or not the kinds that we're interested in and invested in. But the same is true of the courts in the Turkish context. They're not held democratically accountable at all, and in fact are the other element of the unelected branches of government, which stand behind another important division that exists in the Turkish context between government and state. So government here, which stands for hükümet, the Turkish word, versus state, devlet. One of them is understood to be the elected expression of political power that alternates around elections, that is connected to concept of popular sovereignty and so forth, and the democratic process. The other, the state, is the civilian bureaucracy, the core functions, executive and administrative of the state, which are actually quite separate in the minds of most of the Turkish electorate, and certainly in the design of the Turkish constitutional order. And they are to be insulated in some ways from too much interaction with or too much accountability to the elected branches of government, precisely because they are, in fact, serving this allegedly guardianship role around a set of values, constitutional commitments that are taken outside of the political debate. So that are taken outside of the political arena, both by constitutional design and by virtue of the political trajectory that Turkey's taken, again, that Turkuler will speak to around constitutional authoritarianism, but the idea that there are certain Grundnorms that are going to be put in place that can never be reopened. And when I say reopened, it's not so much, and these Grundnorms, again, were addressed a moment ago. Territorial integrity is one of them, a certain conception of nationalism, secularism, and so on. These are founding principles of the Turkish state. It is not only that they cannot be reopened in the sense that one cannot reverse those sets of commitments, one can also not debate the meaning of those commitments. So they're also insulated from reinterpretation. And the battle that we've been seeing, in my view, in Turkey over the last decade, as you have a new set of actors essentially coming to power and engaging in constitutional reform exercises is a battle not over reversing those values, so for example, reversing secularism, establishing a religious state, or having the establishment of official religion, but rather a battle over the capacity to reopen those values to interpretive debate and reassess the meaning of secularism in a country that has an increasingly religiously observant population. Okay, so what are the components of judicial independence then? There are two elements, I think, that were at play in the constitutional reforms. I'm not going to go into the detail I do in the paper about how these reforms actually occurred, what the mechanisms were of the amendments. But the two issues are the composition of the court and the appointments and promotions procedure of the judiciary more generally. These were the two areas of reform that were altered by the constitutional amendments and that altered something about the nature of the court in a way that I claim is positive. On the composition of the court was expanded, and this is typically described as a kind of classic FDR court packing, except one that's actually realized, and you have now an expanded court in which the elected government just gets to appoint a set of judges that it prefers and thereby alter the balance of outcomes in the judgments of the court. This is not actually what occurred in my view. First of all, this expansion took place by taking a set of alternate constitutional judges that were selected under the old procedures and just making them permanent judges, so there was no actual change in the individuals, with the exception of 2 slots, and neither of those slots were chosen by the executive. They were in fact subjected to parliamentary selection, which was a complete novelty. So to back up, the composition of the Turkish Constitutional Court prior to the amendment was chosen from a pool of candidates proposed by a 7-person board that were exclusively candidates from among the high judiciary, and then among those candidates, the selection would be made exclusively by the president. Okay, so get out of your heads anything like the judicial appointments process here, or one that would involve participation from the parliament or other branches of government. It was simply and strictly a decision made by an administrative council together with the president. The new system introduces, first of all, the selection of some candidates by parliament. The eligible pool is radically expanded, but once again drawn exclusively from the judiciary, and judgments about who enters that pool are also made exclusively by the judiciary. So it's an expansion of judicial self-governance that enables a larger proportion of the judiciary, and importantly, an altered ratio of the civilian to military judiciary to make these decisions. So again, without getting into too much detail, the earlier mechanism empowered a significant proportion, both of the council that made these decisions and of the pool from which eligible candidates were chosen, to come from the military courts. And while the military courts continue to be represented both on the council that makes the selection and in the pool of eligible candidates, its representation is somewhat diluted. So that, again, to me, on balance, is an improvement. The second area, so that was the composition of the Constitutional Court itself. The second area of change, which portends a very significant transformation over time, not immediately today or tomorrow, but in the coming decades, of the composition of the judiciary as a whole, is that that council of 7 persons was expanded radically to include many more parts of the judiciary, so many more both levels of the judiciary and elements of the civilian judiciary in particular are now represented in the council that makes decisions about promotions and appointments. This is critical in my view because the way that judicial self-government worked in Turkey, judicial self-governance, was to create essentially what amounts to a litmus test. Now I use this language because again it's resonant for Americans who understand the American judicial appointments process, except that much like many other features of the Turkish system, what we view as a counter-majoritarian problem in the United States, you have to then multiply by some incredible order of magnitude. Think of it as litmus test on steroids, whereby individuals are basically tested throughout their career for commitment to a very specific set of values based on outcomes of decisions in which they don't even offer their reasoning for the most part. So it's a completely outcome driven. Are you finding in favor of the state? How often are you finding in favor of the state? Under what circumstances? And so forth. And it's after passing a series of tests like this that you could possibly be promoted to a higher court by a very small council comprised of persons who've already made it to the highest courts, dominated by military courts. So this is a deeply illiberal system of judicial promotions and appointments, clearly, I think, and I try to describe it in more detail in the paper, that has now been democratized. What do I mean by democratized? Not that the elected branches of government are now making these selections or engaging in judicial governance, but rather that a larger proportion of the judiciary, which at its lower levels is more representative of the population as a whole, now participates. So you have judicial self-governance in which the judiciary itself has a larger prospect of being somewhat representative of the underlying society over which these kinds of decisions are being made. That's the sense in which the judiciary has been democratized here. And again, I think that this is an extremely important innovation. Now, there are two last things I want to say. The first is, I think, based on what I've just said, that in societies that are under transition from authoritarianism, that is the rule of the few, to a democratic system, the rule of the many, it's actually very important to redescribe judicial independence as independence from elite capture. And I think that these mechanisms, which are not about placing the judiciary under the control of the executive or the legislature, but rather about preventing that kind of self-perpetuating oligarchy from being produced, are extremely important in transitional contexts in ways that they may not be equally important once the transition is complete. So that's the sort of Ron Herschel corollary. I think it's an institutional design question. The second point I just want to make in closing is, actually the Turkish judiciary has acted very, very badly since these amendments were put in place. And I just want to be very clear that it has no relationship to these amendments. So the lower courts have engaged in widespread pretrial detention of the press in particular, to some extent opposition forces. And then there's the second ongoing set of trials related to coup allegations, which actually predate these amendments. Both of these are very consistent with the way in which the Turkish judiciary has operated generally, which is to say, with very poor procedural standards, with great tolerance for national security invocations, with a kind of counterterrorism posture that is utterly tolerant of lengthy pretrial detention and torture and so forth. These are horrible features of the Turkish political system, but one has to be clear that what I'm suggesting is valuable in the amendments that were undertaken. A, will take decades to actually pass through the system. You have to wait at least a generation for promotions and appointments to actually reflect the change that's been made. But secondly, has no connection at all to these two trends. And so I think people who felt in September 2010, oh no, these are terrible amendments, today feel we're vindicated, look at how terrible the courts are. And the reality is I think there's next to no relationship between those two outcomes.
Thank you. Now we turn to the other great pillar of Ataturk's constitution, which is the military.
Can I use the podium?
Yes, you can use anything you want.
Let me echo Aslı's comments and thank Sujit for inviting us here. This is a great panel. It's an honor to be here with Aslı and Turku and Professor Issacharoff as well. So ever since it became clear that the Islamists would dominate Egypt's parliament, the liberal Egyptians and Western nations alike have been wringing their hands over the prospect of a theocratic Egypt. And as a possible antidote to an Islamist takeover of Egyptian politics, several commentators floated this idea of a Turkish model. Now, that phrase recently has come to mean very different things. It refers to a multitude of purposes that the Turkish government and legal system can serve. What I have here, or in mind here, is the idea that the military would define its own role under the new constitution, new Egyptian constitution, including some authority to intervene to protect any overreaching by the Islamists. Now, vast majority of the commentators, though, are less optimistic over the prospects of a Turkish model for Egypt. Although the military's leadership in the initial overthrow of the Mubarak regime was widely praised, many analysts agree that the Egyptian military needs to get out of politics immediately and completely. Otherwise, they argue, the generals risk transforming Egypt into a military dictatorship and prevent democratic consolidation. Now, in this article, I argue that both sides are wrong. I think the literature is incorrect, that any constitutional role for the military in a democracy, however limited it might be, is automatically normatively undesirable. At the same time, though, I think the Turkish model goes too far and tilts the balance too much in favor of the military and military-friendly counter-majoritarian institutions. What I have in mind here is sort of a diluted version of the 1960 model in Turkey. I don't think the 1980 coup in Turkey can be a model for any nation. It brought an illiberal constitution to Turkey along with brutal excesses, whereas the 1960 coup, the military deposed an authoritarian government, turned power over to the people within 2 years, and drafted what many people view as a liberal constitution. So there is a middle ground. The military in certain contexts and within limits can play a democracy-promoting role in certain nations. Over time, of course, the idea is that the military's role would be gradually diminished and democracy would be consolidated. So in this talk, I'll first talk about the theoretical basis for understanding the constitutional and political role of a military in a nascent democracy, and then I'll give some examples from Turkey and Portugal to support that theory. And by the way, this is not just the Turkish model, it's also the Portuguese model. The Portuguese military played a very similar role to Turkey in 1974. It deposed an authoritarian Estado Novo regime, turned power over to the people, drafted a new constitution, reserved some power for itself, and then got out of politics within 6 years. I'll then discuss the implications of the theory for Egypt. Before I begin, I wanted to give a prefatory note here. I don't mean to suggest that a constitutional role for the military in a new democracy is always desirable. Is the military a threat to democracy? Sure. In many cases, the answer is yes. Some newly established democracies can progress without any military involvement, and I think Tunisia is a good example of that. It's a relatively stable, homogeneous country while Islamist forces are moderate in nature, and military involvement is unnecessary and might actually hinder democratic consolidation. But in certain nations, the military isn't the only threat, or even the greatest threat to democracy. Because the ideal conditions to promote and sustain a democracy may not be present in certain newly established democracies, I argue that within limits, the military can sort of play this democracy jump-starting function. So the theory in the article is really a second-best theory. So let's turn to that theory. Democratic regimes that have emerged from a long period of authoritarianism, for the reasons that Professor Issacharoff mentioned, are fragile. They're prone to breakdown. As the French revolutionary Mirabeau once said, when you undertake to run a revolution, the difficulty is not to make it go, it's to hold it in check. New democracies may be captured by a powerful but potentially dangerous faction. That faction can use the newly established democratic processes to undermine democracy and turn its temporary majority into a permanent one. So there's a serious risk of rebound to authoritarianism. Or in the case of the ongoing revolution in Libya, sectarian tensions which were kept in check by the authoritarian regime may detonate following a revolution and create violence, instability, and possibly even civil war. As we speak, tribal clashes in Libya are claiming dozens of lives. And there is no stable institution in Libya like a hierarchical and structured military to quell those conflicts. And so in the existing power vacuum, the sectarian violence in Libya may come to be a full-blown civil war and derail the establishment of a long-awaited democratic regime in Libya for which the Libyans fought so hard. And as the Russian, Chinese, and Iranian revolutions also demonstrate, revolutions tend to produce unintended and sometimes dangerous consequences that are contrary to the revolutionaries' goals and aspirations. Now, of course, the danger that a single faction can capture a democracy exists in all democracies. But I think that concern is especially salient in newly established ones. New democracies tend to lack a culture of political pluralism. They lack legal and political institutions necessary to sustain a competitive democracy. They also lack effective enforcement mechanisms designed to ensure that political actors do not misbehave. It might therefore be necessary to preserve some admittedly undemocratic checks and balances on the democratic branches to ensure that democracy can form. Now, in many cases, the military may be uniquely situated to perform a democracy promoting role, especially in the aftermath of a military-led transition from autocracy to democracy. Although an authoritarian regime extinguishes most political and social pluralism in the country, the military is often left untouched. And when the nation undergoes this transition from autocracy to democracy, the military may be the only remaining stable, legitimate, and autonomous institution that can serve as a stabilizer of the new democracy and an arbiter between competing factions. Now, I don't suggest that the military has this independent, altruistic commitment to democracy that fuels this democracy-promoting role. Rather, it's self-interest. The military has two institutional interests that might align with the conditions conducive to the promotion of democratic rule. One is intrastate stability, The other is a promotion of political pluralism. Intrastate stability. That tends to promote, of course, the advancement of a nascent democracy. If the regime is unstable, if it's marked by violence, then the institutions necessary to support democracy can never form. And the military might protect intrastate stability by preventing, via force or the threat of force, any sectarian conflict that can derail the establishment of a long-lasting democracy. And intrastate stability, in turn, promotes the interests of the military as an institution. An unstable regime is a distraction for the military. It detracts the military's main focus, which is to protect the nation from external threats. And by reserving an ongoing constitutional role for itself, the military may actively serve as a stabilizer of the new democracy, allowing democratic institutions and a robust civil society to form and progress. Second, for obvious reasons, political pluralism is a crucial component of a newly formed democratic regime. And in some cases, the military as an institution will have an interest in maintaining political opposition and preventing the domination of the government by a single politically powerful group. If a political party becomes too strong, that party can threaten the military's interests. For example, the governing party may attempt to curb the military's power or strip the military of its economic and social privileges. I think that's certainly true for Egypt. The military is concerned that the Muslim Brotherhood might strip it of its vast economic and social privileges. And I think for that reason, the military in Egypt has some incentive to promote political pluralism. And the military might find so comfort and autonomy in the division of powers that political opposition and pluralism would produce. And the military could achieve that end by creating counter-majoritarian institutions in the Constitution, like a constitutional court and a national security council. In some cases, the establishment of a presidential system might also help achieve that goal. Some secular groups in Egypt, for example, lobbied the ruling military council to establish a presidential system so that the president can serve as a check on the Islamist majority in the legislature. Now, although the military can play a democracy-promoting function, any ongoing role for the military needs to be limited. If the Constitution provides too much power to the military or to military-friendly counter-majoritarian institutions, democratic consolidation, of course, may be difficult to achieve. And likewise, too much dispersion of political power may create political fragmentation and power vacuums, prompting the military to intervene to fill those voids. In Turkey, for example, a constitution drafted following a 1960 coup created a plethora of counter-majoritarian institutions which ensure that the political parties in Turkey remain too weak and the democracy too strong. That in turn caused the Turkish democracy to fail on at least 3 other occasions and caused further military interventions. Now, the limits on the military's constitutional role can be both temporal and substantive. Temporal limitations allow the military to play a stabilizing role in the new democracy until democratic governance structures have been established and a robust civil society to support them have been formed. That's what happened in Portugal. After the Portuguese military handed power over to democratically elected leaders, it reserved powers for itself, but those powers lasted for only 6 years. After that period elapsed, the Portuguese legislature was allowed to amend the constitution to remove the military's authorities, and the military completely retreated to the barracks. And during that interim 6-year period, the military performed an important function in keeping communist forces in check in Portugal and supporting the formation of a robust civil society. Substantive limitations can also ensure that the military's ongoing role does not prevent democratic consolidation. In many cases, the establishment of a constitutional court and a national security council can be sufficient for the military to play this democracy-promoting function that I've discussed so far. The establishment of a court with the power of judicial review may prevent any usurpation of authority by the political branches. And backed by a powerful military, the judges on the constitutional court may feel less pressure to succumb to the demands of the political branches or any extremist forces in the political branches and find more comfort to uphold the rule of law. Thank you. Likewise, a National Security Council comprised of military and civilian members whose mission is carefully limited to an advisory role in the context of national security matters would facilitate a regular dialogue between the military and the political branches and provide a forum for the military to promote interstate stability and political pluralism. Again, following the 1974 coup in Portugal, the Portuguese military created a Council of the Revolution, which played that democracy-promoting role. So I've got 5 minutes left, and I'll talk about what this theory means for Egypt. I'll offer some preliminary thoughts with the caveat that, as with any comparative lesson, these thoughts are merely instructive, and there are always significant problems with the wholesale transposition of one context or one concept from one context to the other. Now, if the Islamists who now dominate not only the parliament but also the Constituent Assembly that will draft a new constitution in Egypt seek to establish an autocratic theocracy or seek to draft a theocratic constitution, as some analysts fear, the Egyptian military may be the unlikely savior of Egypt's democracy. In a nation like Egypt, accustomed to rule by dictators and controlled now by well-funded and well-organized Islamists, the military may be the only devil that the Egyptians know. Many Egyptians who opposed any constitutional role for the military have, following the Islamist parliamentary victories, found some solace in the military's attempt to protect the constitution from any overzealous tendencies. Now, during the democratic transition process, the Egyptian Military Council, the SCAF, Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, signaled its intent to play this role. General Mamdouh Shaheen offered a telling glimpse into the military's intentions. He said, and I quote, "We want a model similar to that found in Turkey. Egypt as a country needs to protect democracy from the Islamists." And I think the SCAF's actions, at least some of them during the transition process, corroborate that statement. The SCAF announced a set of supra-constitutional principles that would bind the Constituent Assembly in drafting a new constitution. Of course, those principles try to guard the military's interests, but they also try to protect individual liberties and minority rights, which many interpreted as an attempt to preempt any power grab by the Islamists in the Constituent Assembly. The SCAF also attempted to control the makeup of the Constituent Assembly that would draft a new constitution to make it more representative. And interpreting these moves as a potential threat to its anticipated parliamentary power, the Muslim Brotherhood staged massive protests and caused the SCAF to relent and abandon these plans. Now, although the Egyptian military may be able to play a role in counterbalancing the Islamists in the parliament, I think Egypt should avoid heeding too closely to the Turkish model. Instead, the Egyptian military should retain a limited advisory role through a National Security Council, which actually is already in place. Similarly, it should protect the autonomy of the Egyptian Constitutional Court, so the court can protect individual liberties, especially women's rights and religious minorities. The military has already taken steps to do that. It altered the process for the selection of the Chief Justice for the Egyptian Constitutional Court. The president is now selected based on seniority from the justices currently on the court and not by the political branches. And the military believes the selection process will serve as an insurance policy, and this goes back to Rand Herschel's hegemonic preservation thesis and Tom Ginsburg's view of judicial review as an insurance policy against elected governments in the future. And so a supervisory role for the military, again, sounds provocative, and it's certainly not what the revolutionaries had in mind when they toppled Mubarak in February, but it may be better than the alternative.
Thank you. Okay. Question to start the conversation. The papers all work out from the historic experience in Turkey, the very complicated historic experience of effectively 100 years of the post-Ataturk constitution and the mixed institutional history of Turkey since that time. But if we project outwards, what can we draw from this? It is clear that societies in transition from authoritarianism to some constitutional or democratic or just simply post-authoritarian regime are going to face certain kinds of characteristic shocks. They are likely to have border conflicts with their neighbors that may have been held in check during periods of greater autocratic stability. They are likely to have a reemergence of civil unrest as between different sectors of the population that have whose conflicts have been suppressed sometimes during the autocratic regime. They are likely to have a desire for revenge by the more oppressed parts of the population against those sectors of the population, sometimes religiously defined, sometimes ethnically defined, who were basically in cahoots and profited from the former autocratic regime. There's a series of these kinds of shocks that are going to emerge. And the question is, how do you deal with them in an anticipatory fashion? How do you manage to structure the institutions of a new society? Now, we look around the world and we see that sometimes courts, to take Asla's focus, have played a very positive role in that transitional period. I would point to the Ukrainian court in the initial days. I would point to the Polish court today. I would certainly point to the South Africa court as a great constitutional court. And sometimes they have not. Sometimes they have been captured institutions. Asla's wonderful formulation of guaranteeing independence from elite capture has failed in many, many countries. You look at the military, and there's a claim that they have a commitment to political pluralism because they draw from much of the society. Maybe yes, maybe no. In Syria and in Libya, that was not the case. And the military was the buttress of repressive regimes in large part because of its ethnic homogeneity and the fact that it corresponded to a tribal or sectarian interest in the society. And then you look to constitutionalism, and the insights are just wonderful, because constitutionalism of its own, you know, it sounds good. We've all become constitutionalists, but Constitution doesn't tell us anything normatively if we don't know what the content of the Constitution is and what kinds of institutional arrangements it enshrines. It can as easily be a meaningless constitution, as I would maintain the Soviet Constitution is, or a constitution which facilitates authoritarian elements of the regime, as in Turkey post the military coup of '80. And then, so what do we take from this? And so I'd like to ask the panelists that when you generalize out from the Turkish experience, how robust do you think the lessons are? What's the takeaway point? What's the generalizable point?
Okay, so I mean, I think that actually the examples that you pointed to of courts that have successfully contributed positively to consolidation during democratic transitions supports the kind of argument I'm making. So if we look at the South African court, there was great attention paid to the composition of that court and making that composition of the court reflective of the very kinds of reforms that were being undertaken. And what I'm suggesting here is not so much that as an institutional design matter, we have to always worry about courts. I think it's just important to understand the relationship between how it actually is structured as an institution at the sub-constitutional level, at the level of promotions, appointments, the actual courts from which the apex court is drawn and so forth, in understanding what role it's likely to play. And I think that that's a lesson that the South African court also illustrates, specifically in a society in which you have had an overweening role for the military or for the executive. I think continued, domination by either the executive or the military or both in the appointments process is going to render the court very much an instrument of counter-revolution, and that's a problem.
But can I ask a specific question? Sure. In many of these countries, precisely because of these problems and the transition period part of the transition is the negotiation, as in South Africa, most notably, is the transition of for the creation of a new apex court that is independent of the judiciary, for the obvious reason that you can't have a lustration of the entire prior judiciary. Most of these societies don't have the human capital resources that they can recreate an entire function. You know, this was true after Nazism, it was true in the post-Soviet period. And so, as an institutional design mechanism, is the problem in Turkey that we effectively need to create a new apex court to deal with constitutional transitions?
No. So, first of all, I think that the Turkish case is more like many of the Middle Eastern cases and less like South African or post-Nazi or post-Soviet case, in the sense that we don't have a completely degenerate positive legal system that has been enforced by a compliant judiciary that therefore needs to, as a whole, be completely altered. In other words, it's not the legal system that has enforced a kind of massively discriminatory, repressive regime, but rather has been permissive of it, versus, say, Nazism or apartheid, where, yes, you have trained judges, but you really needed people with a completely different normative set of commitments in order to make any sense of having an apex court that could possibly generate transformation. I think in most of the Middle East, including countries like Egypt, I think of Jordan and so on, probably a lot of the underlying law will remain as is. And even the sort of constitutional text. The question will be how the institutional design changes, enable or don't, popular participation in regimes that were otherwise, at least on paper, allegedly already constitutional republics of one kind or another. Having said that, I think there are a number of other lessons to be drawn in addition to composition, and I don't think taking, I mean, again, if you take a court completely outside of the existing judiciary in a time of transition away from authoritarianism, you run the risk that the composition of that court will in fact entrench a set of elite preferences. Now, those may be preferences we have great sympathy for. So there's also a problem here of social composition of the underlying society and what we understand to be liberal. And if in fact the society doesn't look legibly liberal to us, as is the case in most Muslim majority countries where we feel instinctively that there's something problematic about the underlying commitments, I think we end up then engaging in prescriptions that are, you know, very problematic, and we would understand them to be problematic under different social circumstances. So taking away, and I try to get at this in the paper a little bit, there's, for example, in the Turkish context, a sense that there's something deeply threatening about the social transformation of Turkey, which should therefore, which should be, the institutions of the state should be insulated from. So the fact that you have increasingly publicly present, religiously observant sectors of the society now better enfranchised and more socially mobile and with access to capital and so forth, this has generated a huge cultural rift in the Turkish context that I think is clouding the capacity to perceive the meaning of institutional changes, and I think that risk is even greater in the rest of the Middle East Muslim majority countries. So in light of that, I think it's important to bear in mind that choosing a secular set of liberal thinkers to make up an apex court that's completely standalone from the judiciary runs a host of different kinds of problems. One, questions of legitimacy that are going to get addressed in the second panel about their interpretive function with respect to a constitution, for example, that may have some or many elements that are drawn from an Islamic legal system. Questions of legitimacy just in terms of representativeness and so forth. And what I'm trying to suggest here is that representation is actually important even for the judiciary, by which I don't mean an elected judiciary, but I do mean a judiciary, the composition of which actually reflects the underlying shift in the society in the direction of rule of the many. Now, there are just two very small things I should have mentioned that I do mention in the paper that I want to mention here. The apex court in the Turkish context only recognized individual standing after the 2010 referendum. So individuals had no standing before this court, could not bring rights claims before the court and so forth. Again, we need to adjust and look carefully at the institutional design of these mechanisms before we attach to them meanings that we ascribe as a result of our own institutional experiences. The Constitutional Court was absolutely not a rights defending entity, but quite opposed to that, exactly as Turkuler has described. It helped entrench a constitution that was about state prerogatives over and above the rights of the citizen. And the second thing is that it restricted the jurisdiction of the military courts. And again, the balance between civilian and military jurisdiction is going to be a very important question in all of the countries in transition that we're looking at in the Middle East, not one we're especially accustomed to thinking about as constitutional lawyers in the United States. And so, again, we risk giving kinds of prescriptions that aren't well informed by a set of experiences with the actual challenges that are being faced in this region.
Turkuler, could you Could you follow up directly on that? Because there's a question.
Institutional design and the what Ian Shapiro calls rebuilding the ship at sea kind of approach to that is I think, you know, very much in line with, you know, it's prudential, it's appealing, and I don't really have a kind of principled objection to it other than to say, you know, to sound this warning about a period of you know, trusteeship or, you know, ending up becoming the norm rather than the sort of transitional exception. At the same time, I don't know how much of a parallel Turkey can be in that context because it was, you know, because there, you know, there was always, you know, since the early 20s, there was a representative electoral system, you know, that wasn't what was getting off the ground in either of these instances in 1961 or 1982. That existed. I mean, it was imperfect, but so I'm not sure that I would be able to draw a kind of firm answer from the Turkish context.
So Ozan, you're the most institutional preservationist of the panel. So, so what about the stewardship role that your fellow panelists are so skeptical about? I mean, the military, of all the potential stewards, also, unlike the judiciary, which we know is empowered with neither the purse nor the sword, the military in a country like Egypt, we know, has both and is the only institution that has them. Are you not concerned that you need to put a bigger dagger in the heart of the ancien regime?
Yeah, I mean, so go back to your initial question and then I'll segue into this. Can we generalize from Turkey? The thing about Turkey is that it's extremely difficult to generalize because it has a unique historical context, social context, and a geographic context. And the Turkish model, in many ways, I think, is a Turkish experiment or a Turkish work in progress. It's still ongoing. And so that's why I began my talk with this cautionary statement that in most countries, the military is not going to be able to play the steward role. In most countries, the military is not going to support political pluralism. But we do have some successful case stories here. The Turkish model, I would say, is a semi-successful one. The 1961, and again, the 1980, I think, Turkey has outlined, it produced an authoritarian constitution along with brutal excesses. The 1961, the reason I think it failed in 1971 is because it diluted power too much. It created a second Senate, it created a constitutional court, a national security council, a higher education council, all these bureaucratic checks on the government that were designed to prevent excesses, but they went too far. And that ensured basically that the democracy remained, the political branches remained weak and the bureaucracy strong. And so when can the military play the stewardship model? Or role. I think in many instances it won't be able to, but there are some where it can. And I think they arise when the authoritarian regime has basically destroyed all political and social pluralism in the countries. There is no other stable institution to provide this role. And by the way, and this is why the coup happens in the first place. If you look at Egypt, the Mubarak regime was unwilling to step down, and then the Egyptian military stepped in and pulled the rug out of under Mubarak and shepherded the transition to a democracy. If the military hadn't done that, perhaps Egypt would have been a Syria today. It didn't happen. And so it's possible. I think you need to have a stable, autonomous military. And in an article that's coming out next month, I talk about militaries that stage these types of coups, where they respond to a popular opposition against an authoritarian government. They depose that government for the limited purpose of transitioning the nation to a democracy, and they do it within a short span of time, like 2 years. That's what happened in Portugal in 1974, what happened in Turkey in 1960. The one common characteristic of these militaries that perhaps allows them to play a stewardship role is that they all embrace this model of the citizen soldier. They all have national conscription. The Portuguese military didn't have national conscription, but they had lengthy colonial wars, and so a lot of civilians had actually served in the military. And after decades of national conscription, the military in a very real sense becomes the society. That doesn't mean they won't abuse their power, they still can, But a military comprised of citizen soldiers is less likely to establish a military dictatorship than one comprised of professional ones. And that was actually the concern of Jefferson, Madison, and Adams as well. They wanted to embrace the idea of the citizen soldier and reject a professional army because they thought professional soldiers would be too divorced from the concerns of the society and would be too likely to associate with their leaders.
Okay, so that's an interesting institutional concern, but now I have opposition coming.
Well, I just want to say a couple of things. First, the works in progress, or the fact that Turkey is sui generis, I would agree with, but I think that's true of every country. So I think that when we talk about all of sort of best practices and lessons learned and so forth, that it's extremely important. I mean, most of what goes awry, and I think this was true, and we have experts in the room to speak to this, to some extent in the Iraqi context, is the failure to appreciate context adequately. And I think there's no institutional prescription that's going to help with that. Like, you just need to have people who are deeply invested, which is why I think the role of external advisors needs to be very much tempered, and why it's so great that the center is partnering with, you know, groups that are actually working within the societies in question and so forth, at least in the Egyptian context, from the partners that were named. On the premature constitutionalization point, I just wanted to note that the amendments process in the Constitution has had a sort of varied history in Turkey, but there was at least one period in which there was a very interesting and useful mechanism used, which was an all-parties accord system, in which every party that was seated in parliament, and in fact every party that competed in the elections, was represented in proportion to their electoral share, even if they didn't make it past the 10% threshold in the Turkish context, which is another complicated story, on a kind of an assembly that came together around building a reform package. So this is a much, much more inclusive model. The 1961 and 1982 constitutions were both drafted by expert groups. They may have been very good constitutional lawyers, and the same attempt was made in 2007, by the way. Great draft, very much consistent with the European Convention of Human Rights, written by a 5-person council of wonderfully liberal constitutional lawyers, one of whom taught at Harvard, et cetera. This is not the way to build a constitution with buy-in, if that's what you're describing. So whether or not you have a staged process is one question, but who is represented in the process? And that's really what's made this current round, the 2012 round, so contested, and what has driven elite polarization, in my view, around the previous packages of amendments as well. It's not the substance of the amendments that's problematic, but the amendments get hijacked, and the whole question of what's actually being done gets hijacked and turns into a vote of confidence around one party or another party, precisely because they fail to engage in that kind of a consensus-building mechanism. And I think that's really where the design, I mean, the design in question should be the design by which that constitution gets buy-in, whether it stages or not. On Ozan, your claim, I just wonder what are the conditions, if you could say a little bit more, and maybe it's the citizen soldier, if you're really saying only countries that have had national conscription for certain numbers of time and so on. But I really do feel as if there must be some conditions to make your claim whole that you have to really specify very carefully, because, for example, if we look at Syria, Syria is a perfect example of a country that does have a very stable and strong military institution, which has absolutely no institutional commitment to political pluralism, and indeed reflects precisely the opposite, reflects precisely the sectarian, and there's no reason I can imagine why we would expect militaries on the whole to have institutional commitments either to the stability of the state as such, or to political pluralism. I just feel like there must be some very specific conditions that you would have to specify to make those expectations hold. And Turkey is a perfect example of why they don't hold. The military very frequently has a deep-seated commitment to instability. It justifies its existence and its powers, its national emergency system, and so forth. We, as Turkuler eloquently pointed out, have lived in a system that from the creation of the Constitution forward, so for over 30 years, has been a state of emergency in which a very significant proportion of our population has faced a low-grade civil war at the hands of the very military that allegedly seeks stability. And I think it's very difficult to credit an argument that says that that somehow, either reflects either the commitments you described in terms of an institution or is somehow consolidating of democracy. And just lastly, to the extent that you're... Okay.
We're out of time. Before you'll get the last word, Turkuler, you wanted to speak first. We're almost out of time. Great point, so go ahead.
So in terms of predictors, Aslı, it's really hard to come up with a set of predictors that says, well, if you've got these conditions lined up, then X will result. This is going to be very context dependent, whether or not it will work. The types of militaries that I'm mainly addressing here are the militaries that actually depose the authoritarian government and successfully shepherd the transition process to democracy, and what role those militaries can serve in the post-authoritarian period. The Syrian example really doesn't work that well because the Syrian military hasn't staged a coup like the Portuguese military or the Turkish military in 1960. The one thing that is, I think, well, we are seeing a lot of defections within the Syrian military. And this is a tactique, I think, used by in Tiananmen Square as well, but the regime will seek to introduce ethnic differences between the users of regime violence and the targets of regime violence, and I think we're certainly seeing that in Syria as well. So the fact that the citizen-soldier model exists, I'm certainly not claiming that automatically that will result in some sort of supervisory role. If the right conditions line up, I think this could work, and for the reasons that I've mentioned, there is a reason why the Egyptian military could promote political pluralism. This is a could. It could work because I think the Egyptian military is skeptical of a really powerful legislature dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis, because I think the military thinks that that will threaten the military's economic and social interests.
Okay, well, I think we would have resolved all of this if we had another half hour, but unfortunately we do not, so it's yours.
Well, please join me in thanking our fantastic panel.